Well, my great-granddad come with the Union Pacific Railroad. He was a master mechanic, I guess, for Union Pacific. And he had a couple of brothers who come from Scotland the same time. And then my granddad was born in Wyoming. Anyway, they decided they wanted a cow outfit. And I don't know how, well, Trapper Jack was supposedly the first one to Florence Creek. And he went out to sell what he had found. And they bought it. And come in here and started the ranching. My granddad was 16 years old when they come. And I don't know whether it was the first year they was here or shortly after. The two uncles drowned in the river. They had a ferry boat in there down by Jack's Rock, just below Florence Creek. And they drowned, and that left him there at 16. I don't remember well, it was around the turn of the century that he sold out to Tom Dilly and went to Round Valley. And then that didn't work out, so he come back and took Range Creek back, or Florence Creek back from Tom Dilly. And then he sold the Florence Creek around 1930. Then that's when my other granddad and my dad and his brothers bought Florence Creek. And then they had it until the late 40s. They sold out to the government to enlarge the Ute Indian Reservation. Then he moved over on the west side.
So originally when your granddad and his uncles came to Florence Creek, they weren't on the river, they was
up above the slough. They told me that they had the first cabin up there, so there was feed for the horses on that slough. And the fireplace is still there. I think the old cabin had burned down. And then they moved from there down to that ledge down just out of the yard there. And then they built another cabin right there by it, and then it burned down. There's several guns burned in it. I've got the old guns.
Tell me the story about Jim's uncle's drowning. Remember you said it was at nighttime? You said they went out and the dog came back. Remember that story?
Well, that's about all anybody knows. That's all I was ever told, that they was their horses and the dog come in. And they never found them or knew any more about it than that.
And who was Florence Creek named after?
It was named after Florence Fuller. She come from Texas. She was Hank Harris's sister. And I don't know whether Fuller was her name or maiden name, or whether I don't think she was ever married, but I never heard of her being married anyway. But that's who she was.
And what did she do up there?
She cooked for them and took care of them.
And they named the creek after her?
Yes. I think it was his uncles that named it after her. I remember seeing the lady, but when I knew her, I can't say I knew her, I seen her. She was down on the LaSalle Mountains then, on the Pace Ranch. I think she was a partner on the Paces. Jack made the boat that he drowned, and he had his traps on that rock that sits out in the middle of the river. And I'm sure nobody knows any more than I know, and that is absolutely nothing.
And do you know why your grandfather moved the cabin from up at the slough down by the river?
It was a better place to live down there. That big spring come out there, and better farm ground, and it was warmer in the winter. It would have been awful cold up there at the slough in the wintertime. It's shady up there. And
when they moved down to the river, they started to build the stone house that's still there.
No, they didn't. They didn't build it right away. had the house, the cabin that burned down. In fact, some of the wood that didn't burn is still in them old krills there. But the next house they built was the old blacksmith shop. They got the logs out of Pine Canyon to build it, and I don't know how long they lived in it before they built the rock house. But my granddad always said that rock house was his downfall. They paid $5,000 to build it. It was as modern as any house around here. They had running water in it, a bathroom. They didn't have a toilet in it, but they had a bathtub, hot water. And he hired a fellow from up at Provo to build that house, and he was supposed to just build a rough rock house. And my dad showed me where they started it, how they started it, and the farther he went, the longer it was taking him to get it built, and the fancier the work was. And finally fired him. And the Seamounts, his brother-in-laws, had settled on Rock Creek, and they told him, they agreed that if he'd go ahead and finish Granddad's house, they'd have him build one up at Rock Creek. And he was a Frenchman, and there's other stories out about who the Frenchman was. There was two Frenchmen. Not the stonemason, the other one was just a ranch hand. But Seamounts, one of the Seamounts, Alf, I believe, built onto the Florence Creek house, and the pretty work on that summer kitchen and the bathroom was done by one of the Seamounts. And he was the one that done the nice work at Rock Creek.
That was Alf?
Alf?
Alf did the good rock work?
Yeah.
And when your granddad had the ranch at Florence Creek, he didn't stay there all year round, correct?
That's right. In the summertime, part of the time he was on the west Tavaputs and part of the time on the east Tavaputs.
And explain a little bit about how they would move the cattle up and down.
In the summertime, they'd take them up on the high elevations, up to around 9,000 foot. And the wintertime, they'd move them back down to Florence Creek and along the river and down on the benches below Florence Creek.
So in the wintertime, would they stay at Florence Creek all winter, or would they just leave the cattle there and then come back?
They stayed with them the year round. That's the reason they survived and the rest other people went broke. They worked for everything they got, the McPhersons and Seamounts both.
But they also had a house in Woodside, is that correct?
I don't know whether I always doubted on the Woodside. They camped there, they'd stay there, but they didn't live there. And after they had kids in school, they moved to Elgin.
So the kids would be at school in Elgin during the year and then come up here in the summer?
Yeah, that's when they built the trail up the river. Before that, they'd cross the river and go out to Woodside.
Well, talk a little bit about Jim's cattle operation. Tell me about the kind of cattle he had and
he had the
so forth.
Best Hereford cattle money could buy. He went to Kansas. He went back there and bought him a bull once. And I think that was another one of his downfalls. He bought that real expensive bull, and they didn't want the bull to drown in the river, so they built a ferry boat. They called it Ironsides. And they worked and worked, and when they got it built, they put the old bull in there and floated him across the river and got him out. Everything went perfect. And the old bull looked back where he'd come from and walked in the river and swam back. They said Granddad got so mad he took a pitchfork and jabbed him in the rear end of the pitchfork and made him swim back across. And then they took him up on top where his summer range was up there, and he walked up to an old bear, and the bear swatted him on the head and broke his neck. He never got a calf out of him, supposedly. Alfalfa. In fact, the first alfalfa that went east of the Mississippi, the seeds come out of Florence Creek. they'd got their seed from California, and then I say out of Florence Creek, the people that had the Range Valley Cattle Company shipped it back east, the seed, which they got from Florence Creek and Range Creek both.
And did they use that alfalfa to sell for seed, or did they also use it to feed the?
They used it for feed for the cattle. They'd wean their calves in the fall and feed them hay in the wintertime. And I know Granddad really felt bad when Joe Walker was killed, because he said he was one of the best friends he'd ever had. But he come out of Texas and got beat out of what he had in Texas, so the Whitmores supposedly was his uncles, and they beat his mother out of what cows and horses she had in Texas. And he come up here and they denied it, and so he was out for revenge and made it as miserable for him as he could do it. And that's the reason he got shot, because they just paid to have him killed.
Would you tell the story of how your granddad was going out to get married and the posse and everything?
He was going out to get married, the date was set, and he was going across the three-ford bench. And the posse was coming, and they thought he might be Joe Walker, and they started shooting at him, and his horse started running and bucking, and finally got him stopped before they got him killed. And so they just took him and made him go with them so he couldn't warn Joe Walker.
And they went back to Florence Creek?
Back to Florence Creek, and he had somebody working there, and they had a boat. And Granddad told him the river was high, not to put that boat in the river, and anyway the posse told him to come and get him, and then they tracked him on up onto the books, and he was camped in what they call Walker's Draw. And they shot him and packed him out.
And there was another guy with him, and then a
couple more was killed at the same time. They thought that one of them was Butch Cassidy, but wasn't.
So your granddad was on his way to get married. What did the Seamounts think when he didn't show up?
Well, my grandmother said I thought he just changed his mind. She told me that with her own words.
And how late was he?
About 10 days late.
And he was on his way to where to get married?
Provo. That's where the Seamounts was from, was Provo. And then after they got married, the Seamount boys come and worked for Granddad for I don't know how long.
Well, tell me a little bit about the Seamounts, how they got to this area and so forth.
Well, they come as Mormon converts and got to Provo, and the streets wasn't paved in gold, and there was nobody there to meet them, and they about starved to death. They got off on the train there, and it was raining, and so their dad put the old lady and the kids under somebody's porch because it was raining, and he went to try and find a hotel and fell in a well and couldn't get out of the well until the next morning. And my grandmother said she could still remember that old woman, that the house was out there at the room trying to push him off on this doorstep. And anyway, the Seventh-day Adventists took him in, and that's the rest of it's history.
So your grandfather probably met your grandmother at the Seventh-day Adventist church?
Church, yes. The McPhersons was, I connected to the Seventh-day Adventist some way.
Well, tell me a little bit about your grandmother, Tora. What was she like?
She was real religious. And there at Florence Creek, they packed a little organ. And Sunday they did, or take that back, on Saturday they didn't do anything except play that organ and sing and read the Bible.
And What was she like? Was she a quiet person?
Real quiet and real kind. Everybody liked Mother Mac. They called her Mother Mac and him Dad Mac.
And how many children did they have?
I see they had five. The first boy burned up in a fire. And then five girls and the boy after that.
And when she was at the ranch, was she mostly just taking care of the kids, or did she do some of the ranch work, or what?
Take care of the kids, and they didn't have a ranch in Green River. They just had a house and some big barns there where they kept their show bulls. I'm sure she done whatever had to be done. In fact, I've got a picture of her branding a cow in her dress. The only time I ever thought there could have ever been any friction there, one of the great-grandkids of the Sea Mountains come to visit me a couple of years ago, and he brought it up 2 or 3 times. How come McPherson's never went broke and Sea Mountains did? Like maybe there may have been some friction there, but I'd never heard it other than that.
Well, what was the story that you heard of why the Seamounts operation failed? Wasn't there like a blizzard or something?
They went up on Steer Ridge. They opened the trail up, and it was a fairly mild winter, and put their cattle up there, and then in March, and a storm come and they lost them. But it was just bad luck. They didn't have feed in the low country, and they was trying to find feed. It wasn't that they didn't work. They was hard working. You can look at them old people. I never knew Dan Seamount, and he was dead before I was born, I think, but Bill was round-shouldered like my granddad. You could just look at them old people, and their backs would give out on them, and it was just a rough old hard life, and they was not lazy. They figured God put them here for a reason, and part of that was to work. Well, I've heard how dumb Nutter was all my life, all the dumb things that he did, but you know that old man put a ranch together that they could not take away from him. The sheep men come in, they tried. Nutter beat them. The BLM come in, they tried. Nutter beat them. He had to be a brilliant man. Maybe in some ways, he probably wasn't a cowman like the stories I used to hear about the dumb things he did with cows, but he must have been a businessman, the best.
How about Ben Morris?
Well, Ben Morris, I truthfully can't say I never seen him that I did see him. I heard so many stories about Ben Morris, and it was all when I was just a little kid. But if there was ever a character in the world, it would have been Ben Morris.
Well, what are some of the stories that you heard about him?
Well, they said when he left Oklahoma for his health, they had him handcuffed and couldn't take him back to Oklahoma, and the coffee was boiling over on the fire. They told him to set the coffee off, and he threw the coffee in the sheriff's face and shot him and kept it coming. He was married Josie Bassett, and she gave him 15 minutes to get his stuff and get out. And when he went back, she reminded him, and he said he still had 5.5 minutes coming. He was a squatter there at Chandler, and then he throwed in with Downards and was up at Rock Creek and working for them. And then the Army found out about him, and they come and handcuffed him and took him out and shipped him overseas.
So he was a draft dodger?
Yeah, deserter.
And never came back to Chandler Creek?
He come back when he got out of the Army, but I didn't see him when he come back. He come back and he had some cows with Downards, and I know my dad met him on the trail, and he told him he's coming back to get what Downards had that belonged to him. And my dad said, "Do you think they'll give them to him?" And he flipped the German Luger out. Said he thought they would. And then he lived in Green River for a while. I seen him there. He worked in the hardware store. And then after that, I don't know whatever happened to him. I never heard any more of him. I think probably they both lived in Green River going to school. And then he married my mother, and he was real close to my granddad.
So your father married Jim's daughter?
Yes.
And her name?
Was Pearl.
And so your father worked for Jim for a while?
No, just helped him. I don't think he ever worked for him. Never got a paycheck or anything. I think he just, whenever Granddad needed help and my dad wasn't busy, my dad was anything but lazy. And if anybody needed anything, he was there to help.
And about when did your dad buy the ranch from Jim?
1930. That was the year I was born.
And how long did your dad have Florence Creek?
10 years. We left there in 1941. No, after 10 years after he bought Florence Creek, or bought the Seamount ground on the mountain, Nutters wanted to sell Range Creek, and so my dad bought it. And it was kind of a three-way deal at the time he bought it. He put up the money and took Don and I in as partners. And then after my dad died, Don and I split up.
And about what year did your dad buy Range Creek from Nutter?
51.
That was the Nutter Corporation. Nutter
Yes.
was dead by that time.
Yeah. And Mrs. Nutter was still alive, but not. I think the old Nutter died in about 35, but I don't know exactly, but it was right around. It was after I was born, I think.
But what are your best memories about Florence Creek, about the ranch down there?
Back at Florence Creek?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was heaven on earth.
Why?
Just everything was there.